Hello and welcome to PBS Updates, a new short series from the Oncology podcast where we break down the latest changes to Australia's pharmaceutical benefits scheme and what they mean for oncology practice. This is Rachael Babin from the Oncology Network, and I'm joined by Professor Craig Underhill. In this series, we take a quick look at the recent oncology and haematology updates, what's changed, which patients may benefit, and what clinicians should know. For more detail and ongoing coverage of cancer medicines, you can also visit oncologynetwork.com.au. So, if you want a fast, practical overview of the latest PBS developments, you're in the right place. Let's get into it.
G'day. Welcome to PBS Update for June 2026. It's a great pleasure to be here with Rachael Babin. G'day, Rach.
G'day.
You're telling me you've been pleased with the response to this sort of quite a bespoke podcast, really, but had been doing quite well in terms of the download. So we've obviously hit a bit of a mark.
You know, the short format helps, and just having concise updates all in one place. So yeah, thank you, listeners, for a new series. We're really pleased. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, great. As always, very happy to get any feedback or suggestions from people. So we haven't actually got many new drugs listed this month. Is that just by random chance, or is it because we've had some controversy and a drop-off in potential drug listings in Australia? And we're going to speak in a minute to Professor John Zalcberg about this very issue. But there was one new drug for the month. It's a haematology drug. It's an oral agent called acalabrutinib. So it's a new generation Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitor. People who treat haematology patients will be aware of this drug. So it's a new listing. There was a concurrent listing of venetoclax to fit in with this listing. So this is for people getting first-line acalabrutinib plus venetoclax for people with CLL or small lymphocytic lymphoma. And this introduces, Rachael, a new paradigm really in treatment of CLL, and it's a treatment that's of fixed duration rather than treating until disease progression. So if you go through the detail of the listing, people need to be relapsed or refractory to at least one prior therapy. They need to have active disease in accordance with the International Workshop on CLL guidance for when to prescribe drug for this condition. We'll put a link to that information as well. And so CLL is a very heterogeneous disease. There are people that can be observed for many years before their disease is deemed active under this International Workshop criteria. There are people who need to have immediate treatment, and that's often on the basis of developing cytopenias, progressive or symptomatic splenomegaly, progressive or symptomatic lymphadenopathy, like with large lymph nodes. There's some criteria around a rapid progression in their lymphocyte count, being symptomatic, having night sweats, for example. So we'll list that as a reference for trainees or people who are not so familiar with that work. And so on the listing, people need to have active disease as well as having that symptomatic disease. This needs to be first-line treatment or in a patient that's been intolerant of another treatment. And it specifically says they can't be treated with obinutuzumab. So that's interesting. The listing was based on a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, fixed duration acalabrutinib combinations in untreated CLL. There was investigators in Australia. This is called the Amplify study. Professor John Seymour at Peter MacCallum. G'day, John. John was in my year of medicine. He's S and I'm a U. The groups were alphabetical, so we're often grouped together during pracs or tutorial groups. So I know John quite well from uni days. And liaising with him at Peter Mac. So this was a study in people with symptomatic CLL They were stratified to 3 separate treatments: acalabrutinib, venetoclax for 14 cycles, acalabrutinib, venetoclax, and obinutuzumab, or chemoimmunotherapy, which was an investigator's choice of fludarabine, cyclorituximab, or bendamustine rituximab. The primary endpoint was progression-free survival. So this study showed quite a big benefit for the combination treatments compared to the dealer's choice chemoimmunotherapy. The estimated 36-month overall survival was 94.1% for the acalabrutinib venetoclax, 87.7%, so a little bit lower, or essentially the same for the acalabrutinib venetoclax and obinutuzumab, and 85.9% for the chemoimmunotherapy. So, in fact, this duo combination without the obinutuzumab was sort of the best therapy, and had a slightly lower rate of grade 3 or higher serious adverse events, which was mostly neutropenia in that group. Of note, too, the risk of cardiovascular problems is deemed to be lower with this acalabrutinib compared to other Bruton kinase inhibitors. So it's felt to be a safer treatment and probably more effective. And this is this new paradigm of using fixed duration of therapy rather than treating to progression. So that's much better, obviously, for patients because they can come off treatment and have a period of being free of needing to be turning up for treatment. So there you go. Interesting new listing for the haematologists.
Fantastic. And certainly, as you said, a new paradigm, and it's the nuances that make treatment more manageable in daily life. Less toxicity, that you can stop and start as you need to.
Yeah, just very nuanced. So when I first moved to work in Albury-Wodonga, I was co-managing lymphoma patients with haematologists at the Royal Melbourne Orpaedic Mac. And in that time, treatment has become more nuanced, and there's now prognostic factors that are used and also in stratifying the treatment. So, and that's related to the presence or not of mutation in the IGHV gene, as well as TP53. So there's some nuance in the treatment as well as needing that active therapy. And also the comorbidities can determine which of the treatment options are selected. So this is an important advance. New treatment option looks to be safer, especially in people who have cardiovascular risk factors. And it's oral, or it's all oral. And patients have a fixed duration of treatment and come off treatment and are monitored and have a period of time off therapy.
Excellent. Very welcome news. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We've just had the one. So I happened to run into a mate of mine, Professor John Zalcberg, in Sydney, and we got talking about some controversies related to potential fall off in drug listings in Australia due to some perception of issues with our PBS listing system. So let's have a listen to what John had to say. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor John Zalcberg to PBS Update. John and I ran into each other in the Qantas Lounge in Sydney recently, and we were talking about this issue about potential for companies not to bring drugs to Australia for PBS listing. To Qantas Lounge, of course, John, is where all good networking occurs. So I did a little bit of digging and I found some recent media about this very issue. So I saw some media quoting the BMS CEO, who's formerly a politician in the UK, raising some concerns about the timelines for approval in Australia and the fact that companies may stop bringing drugs to Australia. And then in April, we had Pfizer withdraw its application to the PBAC for a breast cancer drug, and we might talk about that briefly as well. So, John, how has this situation arisen? Historically, we've had slow timelines, and it now seems to potentially have come to a bit of a rub point.
So my view is that we've had two delays in access to new drugs for Australians. And the first is that it takes a long time to get approval for the innovative new drugs. The medicines industry argues that it's over 440 days, maybe longer than that. And certainly, I'm sure the people listening can all quote examples where it's even longer than that. So that's already a problem, particularly because people with cancer have got time-critical illnesses. It's not like you can wait 2 years and get the effective new drug. If you've got hypertension, you might be able to wait 2 years if it's fairly indolent and managed with existing drugs. But some of these drugs, some of these diseases, there are very few treatments available, and the drugs that are becoming available are important to use when they're available rather than sometime in the future. So the delays are one cause of limited access for Australians, and the second, particularly, as I say, for time-critical illnesses like oncology. But the second issue has been that a number of smaller biotech companies often don't even bring drugs to Australia because of the cost, the effort, the small market, relatively small market. And last time we looked, I looked at this a number of years ago now, there were some 30-odd drugs that were available in international markets in the Western world that were not available in Australia. And that's another source of concern. The ultimate reality of all this, though, of course, is that if you're wealthy, and this is why it's so frustrating, because the PBS was set up to provide an equitable system for Australians to access modern drugs. If you are wealthy today, you can afford any of these drugs whenever you need them, as often as you need them, as quickly as you need them. That's for the wealthy, but often quite wealthy. These costs can be quite high. And the rest of the population's missing out. And that's the opposite of why the PBS was set up in the first place. It was set up so that there would be equitable access to modern and effective drugs. And that's the thing that's most frustrating and, of course, the ultimate irony. And that, of course, has always been the case. What I just described is the status quo. But now what we've got is President Trump introducing MFN, Most Favored Nation status, which essentially means that Americans shouldn't have to pay more for the cost of drugs than that is paid for overseas, internationally. And that's not dissimilar, as one might say in parenthesis, to their views about things like defense and so on. But leaving that aside, I guess for a drug that's discovered in the US, even whether it's public money or private money, that's developed in the US or led through the US and then ultimately commercialized in the US, there's an inherent logic in that statement. And I don't think, my personal view is that no president in the future, whatever party they come from, is actually going to reverse that position.
Yeah.
Americans should pay the same as other places will pay. The problem, of course, is that for the US industry, 2/3 of their revenue comes out of the US. And so they've got two choices to deal with MFN. One choice is to lower the price in the US to what they get in the rest of the world. That's one choice, which would obviously bring in less revenue. And the second choice is to restrict access to lower priced drugs in the rest of the world and maintain the US price. And obviously that's what they're likely to do from a commercial point of view. And that risks that these two problems we talked about, both the fewer drugs coming to our shores in the first place, which we have no mechanism to address. If a company doesn't apply to bring a drug to Australia, with very few exceptions, and I can think of two in recent years, but with very few exceptions, there is no way of getting into Australia if the company doesn't want to bring it here. And the delays, of course, are something that we do have control over. And yet, although there's this current HDA review going on, an implementation advisory group, the review was set up in 22, I think, by Greg Hunt. We are now in 26, and we don't seem to be at any step, not one step closer to an overall solution. So the problem is only going to get worse. And I think that's manifest by your comments, Craig, that what we've got here are companies starting to downsize. They simply can't justify the workforce if they're not selling the drug. And that's ultimately what a pharmaceutical company does, right? It sells drugs. If they can't sell the drug, why they can't justify the workforce? And we'll see more of that.
Yeah, on the one hand, we're being told there's a tsunami of work coming with lots of new molecules coming to the market, and there'll be lots of work in Australia for clinical trials. But on the other hand, we're hearing that because of this process, in fact, some of the big pharma are downsizing. their workforces, and they may bring less registrational studies to Australia, which would be a tragedy.
I think with respect to trials, I think there'll be two sort of forces at play, if you like. I think with respect to early phase studies, Australia is seen as a very attractive, relatively inexpensive place, an efficient place to do high quality phase 1 studies. So I think the phase 1 effort will continue. I can't see that getting less in the short term because, as I say, it's cost effective. It's you get good quality data, a Western but multicultural and multiracial society, and so forth. I think registration studies, and of course, what ultimately counts is only 5% of patients are on clinical trials. So what ultimately counts is access to the broader population. The risk is that will be significantly impacted. And some of those things we can't do a lot about. We can't really easily fix what's happening in terms of companies not coming here in the first place. But we can make it attractive for companies that do want to come here. We could do things like shorten the time frames very substantially, especially for the very new innovative molecules. We could certainly do that, and that would make an enormous difference, I think, if we just changed the current way the PBAC and MSAC, for that matter, which is probably even slower than PBAC, works.
Yeah. I did some digging and found some interesting statistics, John. There was a Medicines Australia report that came out, I think, in April or May. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But they said on average, patients were waiting 3.6 years to access treatments already available overseas. And 43% Australians have been prescribed medicines which are not subsidised by the PBS, highlighting the affordability gap and those equity issues you referred to. And interestingly, we have to be careful what we ask for, I guess, because we're seen as having a very good system overall, or we have had. And so Australia now pays 30% less than comparable nations like Canada for new medicines.
And they're slow to get access to. Yeah, look, I think we have had a really good system. I've called it world-class. I think that's a fair statement.
Yeah.
But I think, as you described, the innumerable number of new molecules, often with smaller and smaller indications and populations coming, and therefore, because they are smaller, the higher cost per unit drug. With that happening, the system is just not fit for purpose. And although the HTA review had enormous potential and was seen as a way of trying to say, let's look at this properly and come up with a different model, maybe it will happen, but it certainly hasn't happened yet, and we're 4 years down the track. And when we started, we didn't even have MFN to worry about. So now it's going to be an even hard problem to deal with. Yeah, it's not an Australian-only problem, though. There's a piece today in Med News, which you may have seen, which is a blog that Megan Brodie puts out, and she'd interviewed a doctor who works with the German regulator with access to drugs in Germany. And although he didn't assign so Germany and other countries in Europe, despite a much higher price per quality that is currently paid, the figure in the article is something like €100,000 per quality, and which is generally, one imagines, much higher than, we don't know the Australian prices, but likely to be higher than Australian prices. Even in Germany, this is becoming an issue. And questions are being asked like, why are they so expensive? And one is the cost of trials, of doing the actual trials.
Yeah.
And as you know, and as everyone in the audience will know, there's enormous wastage of money in the conducted trials, enormous amounts of data collected and never used. We do things which are incredibly bureaucratic. So there's a cost of trials, but if nothing changes, we've probably got a worldwide problem, because how is any country going to be able to afford those prices? Even in Germany, where they pay a lot more than we do, that's not high enough for the US market. And so then it becomes an issue, how do we resolve that? And if I use an example, the new drug for daroxatinib for pancreas cancer that was presented at ASCO this year, the meeting we attended, resulted in a standing ovation when the survival data were presented. When I asked a colleague who works in the industry, but nothing to do with the company involved that owns the drug, when I asked him what he thought it would cost, his initial response, so we've got no idea this is accurate, this is a total guess, was $30,000 a month. Now, if if you think about that, this drug was associated with a 13.5 months median survival.
Yeah.
So, yes, it doubled survival, but it was still 13.5 months. How quickly are Australians going to get access to a drug?
Yeah.
It's a revolution in the management of this condition, but people who get the drug, second-line pancreas cancer, on average live 12 months. I mean, you know what I mean by on average. It's 13, I think it was, at 12 months, I think it was 53.3% median survival.
So on average, we're looking at something like $400,000 a year.
So that's a guess as to the cost. No one knows. I don't even know if the cost has been set by the company yet. So we're totally guessing here. But that number is not excessive when you think about some of the other drugs on the market currently in the US and prices that they demand. And yet the FDA is out there pushing the company to provide access to this drug to Americans. Unfortunately, we do not have an Australian government pushing to get that drug to Australians.
Yeah. Another good example, John, our regular listeners will know all about deruxtecanib. We've spoken about it a couple of times on our regular podcasts, and it is exciting data. And the other issue we talked about was the capacity of a small company like that to really ramp up production, maybe an issue. But another recent example is this drug, tucatinib, which is a Pfizer drug, which was approved for PBS listing in November last year. And in April, Pfizer decided to walk away from the price negotiation and quoted, I understand, that the new US system as an issue. I saw a press release from BCNA about it. They were pointing out that the drug's already been approved in the UK since 2022. The publication came out in the New England Journal in 2020. So we're 6 years later. It's for women with HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer, in particular those with brain metastases, because it's an oral tyrosine kinase inhibitor that crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's a relatively prevalent cancer, but it wouldn't be a huge number of people per year who would need access to the drug.
Yep.
The total cost is capped at $64,000, but many patients just can't afford $64,000, and it adds prolonged overall survival by on average 9 months for patients with brain metastases. So, it's not curative, but it's a substantial step forward.
Yeah.
So that, it's getting the right balance, isn't it? We want to make this accessible. The company needs to be recompensed for the cost of development of the drug, but they need to be affordable. So I think it's a difficult situation we're in.
Look, the problem is that these numbers, 9 months extra, I mentioned 13.5 months, they're all taken in a sort of absolute sense. What I think, I'm not sure that the non-clinicians in health departments and so on appreciate is that a lot of these benefits are incremental and they compound on each other. Yeah. And so that, in fact, you won't be able to do trials of HER2 agents in the future because it will assume you've received tucatinib and you won't have, for example. But equally, as I say, there are incremental benefits that are far beyond the actual results of an individual trial. I mean, I look at something like colon cancer. Metastatic colon cancer, untreated, was associated with a survival of 6 months back in the day. Now we're talking 3 to 4 to 5 years. And very few of those drugs were anything that are now used in this condition. Very few of them were anything but incremental. They were incremental changes. They got approved, they're available, and now people get multitude of different drugs and survivals change from 6 months to, let's call it, 5 years. That's an enormous change over a couple of decades, but it's due to incremental benefits. And so the 9 months of tucatinib is not about 9 months extra. It's about 9 months extra on top of the extra other new drugs, the drugs that are going to come. And so whilst this individual drug's not a cure, it's the accumulation of effective drugs given appropriately by skilled clinicians that makes the difference.
Yeah. So the overall survival was 21.9 months in the patients receiving these drugs, and they had also previously had trastuzumab, trastuzumab, emtansine.
Yep.
So it's a multi-year survival for these patients built on the previous group. So you're exactly correct.
The other thing that you mentioned that I think is really important, I also noticed that press release from BCNA, which BCNA has been somewhat involved in an advocacy for new treatments, but I was glad to see it because it's critical that the consumer groups in this country actually stop worrying about are companies making profits or not. Yes, they probably are making profits. It's not our concern. Our concern is to look after patients and to look after the community. And what we've got to do is get more of these drugs to patients, not fewer. And I think there's been tendency in some of the consumer organizations to worry about, the drugs are too expensive. We can't fix that. Our job is to advocate for access. It's the government's right to ration access. I agree with that. That's their job. But then they've got to be transparent with the public and say, we don't think that's important and we're not going to approve it. And if that's what they want to say, so be it. But they get elected by the community and they've got to stand up to the community if they want to ration healthcare. And at the moment, there's no transparency.
Yeah. So, John, being mindful of that, this is in the public realm, but this is probably a hard question. Where do you think this issue needs to go in terms of should there be further look at reforming the PBAC, trying to speed up the system or trying to benchmark, what is our pricing compared to countries like Canada now? What do you think is the way to go to ensure we can try and improve the situation without paying unfair prices for the drugs?
I think the way forward is several things. I think government should continue to do what it does well, which is to consider cost effectiveness and negotiate the best possible prices they can. I'm fine with that. But what I don't want is for the Pfizers of the world, and I've got no current relationship with Pfizer, just to be clear, but for the Pfizers of the world to walk away because they couldn't agree on a price. Negotiate means you reach an agreed price. Negotiate hard, negotiate day and night, negotiate away, but that means end up with an agreed price at the end, which means people in the community who need them will have access. So I don't think we shouldn't negotiate. I think we should, and we should negotiate hard, but we shouldn't force vulnerable people with cancer or other serious time-critical illnesses to miss out on treatment whilst the negotiations occur. And that requires some interim access to treatments, which are available in the rest of the world and which could be provided to Australians whilst the negotiation occurs. If the negotiations are unsuccessful, then I guess future people with that condition won't get it. But negotiate for me means reach an outcome. It doesn't mean walk away. And if you reach an outcome, then the future generations of patients will also receive it. So that's what I think I would like to see from government. I'd like to see the actual recommendations of the implementation advisory group that was derived from the HTA review start to get implemented quickly and efficiently in a way that improves access. And one of them is to eliminate this time frame delay. I think that's going to be a really important thing to do. In the end, it may not work. And I agree that, there will be prices that people say we just cannot afford to pay, but government needs to be transparent about that. And government and transparency seem to be oxymorons, I'm afraid. I just read the article about I won't say too much about this, but the cost of keeping people on the route, the cost of drugs is infinitesimal compared to the investment in healthcare that this provides.
That's right. Because our funding's always been on the basis of cost effectiveness. So it's not just the drug cost, but it's all the other. So if you keeping young women with metastatic breast cancer and brain mets alive in the workplace, looking after their kids.
That's an investment. And that's
that's exactly right.
Yeah. And spending money on prisons in Nauru is not an investment, but then there we go. That's my politics. As I say, we've got a great system. It needs to be fit for purpose in the current era. There's so many molecules coming that are going to help people, and we need to find a way to move forward and not just wait and be told that companies are downsizing and leaving shores. That would be a disaster.
All right. Thank you very much, John. It's been great to talk and to pick your brains, your wealth of knowledge and experience. So thanks very much.
No problem. Thanks, Craig. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks, Craig. I'm so glad that you caught John in the Qantas lounge. As he said, that seems to be where all the good networking and conversations are held these days.
Yeah, well, big shout out to Mr. Qantas. We're talking about his pajamas. We're talking about his lounge. So anyway, that's all we have for this episode. We should remind our regular listeners, if they haven't already, download the 2-part ASCO update. There's some great information there. Professor Chris Jackson and Dr. Kate Clark both went to Chicago and ran the gauntlet of customs and the karaoke bars. And it's a pretty informative but also a fun couple of downloads for people to listen to.
Absolutely. They are very fun. And I should mention, actually, that's why this June update is towards the end of the month. We usually like to do them at the beginning of the month. But understandably, we all had our focus and energy on ASCO and all the amazing updates that came there. But yeah, as ever, the OJC team have fun as well as pack in lots and lots of educational content. So there are downloadable bingo cards if you want to play along with ASCO Bingo.
Fun for all the family. So that's great. We'll talk again soon, Rachael, about any listings in July. And I've heard about a compassionate access program that's just new. We might talk about that as well.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Craig.
Please don't take what we say at face value. Please do your own research, do your own due diligence, check the drug indication, be across the efficacy and toxicity data, discuss it with your patients before embarking on prescribing any of these bloody difficult to say drugs.
That's all for this episode of PBS Updates. For more information on the listings we discussed and for ongoing coverage of cancer medicines, visit oncologynetwork.com.au, where you'll find news, analysis and resources for oncology professionals. If you're working in industry and have details of compassionate access schemes or upcoming PBS changes you'd like us to share with the oncology community, feel free to get in touch. And don't forget to check out the Oncology Journal Club podcast if you'd like to hear more analysis and pearls of wisdom from Professor Craig Underhill. This podcast is proudly produced by the Oncology Network. Thanks for listening.